Okay. Let's have a conversation. I'm right here. Where's this mystery voice? Like the Wizard of Oz. It's the Wizard of Oz. We're going to get some flying monkeys in here pretty soon. It's going to be awesome.
Send in the witches.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Ryder Smith. I'm with a firm called Trepepi Smith. We are consulting with the City of Yorba Linda to help with community outreach and engagement and public education and information on this important policy matter. We work in about 140 cities in California doing all sorts of communication support work. I got a team of about 60 people. Sarah Madsen, who you may have met up front sitting behind the table, she works with my team. I'll also just note that tonight's meeting is being recorded. There's a magical tripod over there with a camera on it. I have somewhere back in the back right there, that guy right there, Ethan, he's also on my team helping with some of the audio tonight. And then along those lines, we also have, I'm going to get to some intro. Actually, before I get to my other introductions, real quick, the magic of QR codes. So first of all, for anybody who was at the workshop on Tuesday night, I want to offer my early apologies. We had a very dim bulb on a projector. It was hard to read until we had very romantic lighting, and then it was a little too romantic for the room. So tonight we have a much better projector. But if you wish to download the PowerPoint deck that we're going to go through tonight, if you just scan with your phone, you click the top one, it'll open right into the PowerPoint slides in PDF. And if you secondarily, I would encourage you to generally learn all about local control and housing policy in Yorba Linda and visit the yllocalcontrol.com website where we have a ton of information, ton of videos that's available for you to supplement your knowledge and understanding of the issues and learn more about this important policy matter. So, in addition to Team Trepepi Smith that's here tonight, we also have some experts in the room who are here to answer questions and engage in conversation this evening, as well as some fellow residents who were involved in a citizen working group, a resident working group, that was focused on devising and coming up with the housing element draft concept that we have right now that's working its way through this workshop process. So first I'm going to introduce my experts over here. We have a microphone that's going to work for you guys if you flick it on, hopefully. There you go.
Got it, check.
All right, go ahead. You first, David.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Brantley. I'm the Community Development Director for the city. I've been here since 1993 with a 2-year hiatus to the city of Costa Mesa, and then I got invited back. I'm glad to be here, cherish this community, and happy to talk to you about the housing element and answer any questions you have. Pardon me. This evening, and look forward to some good questions from you. I'm going to pass this over to Nate now.
Hi, I'm Nate Farnsworth. I'm the city's planning manager. My primary responsibility, aside from managing everything that goes on within the planning division, is this housing element. So I've been working on this project for probably since 2018, with attending multiple meetings with Peggy Wong, former council member, up in Los Angeles at the Southern California Association of Governments on a monthly, probably multi-monthly, multiple times a month up in LA, riding the train up there. So that's who I am, and I'll pass it over to Todd.
Hey everybody, I'm Todd Litfin. I'm the city attorney. I've worked for the city since 1995. I was also gone a couple of years. I've been city attorney of Irvine. I'm currently city attorney of Yorba Linda, Villa Park, and a couple of other places. And I think that's it, right?
I think the only thing otherwise noting, Todd, is you actually met your wife in this very room.
You guys want to hear a funny story? A crowd record? So I went to the Yorba Linda staff Christmas party in 1996. I was single. My wife worked in Parks and Rec. She was dancing on the floor, and the city attorney, my boss at the time, and the city manager had a couple drinks. Back in those days at Christmas parties, you used to be able to drink. You can't do that anymore. So my boss actually put me in a headlock, and he was a big guy. So I'm 6'7", 280. He put me in a headlock, dragged me out there where my now wife is. I always call her my current wife just to tick her off, but so my wife. And he's like, I'm the city attorney of Yorba Linda, and he pointed to my head, and he's like, this is the assistant city attorney, and he wants to dance with you. And she was like, okay. And she looked at my head. I couldn't see because I was like this. And she's like, well, do you want to dance with me? And I'm like, uh-huh. So that is how we met. And then 4 years later, she'll tell you 3 years too long, but 4 years later, we had our wedding reception in this same room, and we did a reenactment with all the same people. It was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. It's an actually true story. So there you go.
So suffice to say, all three of these gentlemen are interweaved in the history of Yorba Linda. And then we have, as I mentioned, a number of resident working group members who participate in the development of the housing element. The resident working group members were, they participated in 6 meetings. Each meeting was at least 2 hours long, if not longer, depending upon how long they were in the parking lot having further conversation after we broke up. And really dedicate a lot of effort and energy to understanding this policy issue. So we have a number of them in the room tonight real quick. I just want you to stand up real quick and say what part of the town you live in and how long you've been in Yorba Linda.
I'm Diane Canny. I've lived in Yorba Linda for 36 years, and I live in Travis Ranch.
I'm Paulina Rodriguez. I live in the Yorba Linda Hills Plan Development Community, and I've lived for 10 years.
I've never needed a microphone, but my name's Nancy Salee. I live over in East Lake. I've been here, I guess, about just under 12 years.
I'm Janice Morger. I lived in Yorba Linda 30 years at least, and on the west side.
My name's Dave Ramasinski, 41-year resident, and I live in the Hidden Hills area.
Go ahead.
I'm Russ Hind. I lived here about 50 years, and I live on the west side and been on the residence committee.
Hi, I'm Don Lockmari. I live on the west side for about 12 years now.
All right, and one more, Mr. De Bruin.
Richard De Bruin. I'm about 42 years in Yorba Linda, an ex-Air Force veteran. And we went through 14 hours of debate with the working group committee to come up with this plan. And of course, there were quite a few discussions along the line. But here we are.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much to my working group members that are here. Feel free to grab them with questions too as we go throughout this evening. At your tables, so when you walked in, you could have grabbed a kind of 4-page brochure document. Do you mind if I hold that up real quick? It looks like this. This is mostly just supplemental information or supportive information, everything you're going to hear tonight. So this really helps you save and not have to take a lot of notes, but that's what that's all about. And then inside that is just a fast and furious little 2-sided flyer that was primarily intended for promoting these events, has frequently asked questions on the back, and if you want to take some of these tonight and go back to your neighbors and hand it out to give them some piece of collateral to talk about this issue, we would love to have you share that information with them. And then at your tables are 2 documents. There's a single sheet document. That single sheet is examples of low-income housing development projects that were built in the city of Yorba Linda and been operating here for a number of years, just to give you some examples of dedicated low-income housing projects that were often built by low-income housing specialist industry groups to support those. And then there's a multi-page document stapled in the upper left corner, and that is examples of various densities, right? Because you're going to hear a lot of conversation tonight about 5 units per acre, 1 unit per acre, 60 units per acre. When you hear those conversations, this is intended to give you some sense of what density looks like when you build housing. And then some of you may be lucky enough to have actually gotten a printed PowerPoint deck at your table. One of our working group members, Russ, was kind enough to fall a tree and then turn it into pulp and then print on it. So you have a tree's worth of paper at your table with the PowerPoint deck if you don't want to otherwise bring it up on the QR code that we had shared. Okay, so that's all the material we're trying to give you tonight to keep you informed. Our priorities this evening are, number 1 is to make sure we're giving you access to lots of information and answering your questions, right? We have legal and housing policy experts here to get through that. The second one is a trust building exercise. We certainly have heard from our working group members and from others that there was a lot of distrust that emanated from the last time we went through this housing process and discussion, and that might have been a contributing factor to why Measure Z, which was an effort to implement the housing element components, failed pretty dramatically on a 75-25 vote, 75 no, 25% yes in November. And so this is us coming to you and saying, what can we do to be more transparent and engaging with you to get you here? And we love having a room full of people like this. We obviously wish we had 400 people in a room like this. But we're appreciative of you coming here, and we're hoping that you come away tonight, go talk to more of your neighbors and friends to let them know what's going on with this very complex policy issue. I would also just say that the whole approach from the city that got me involved in this project was the measure had failed. We were trying to figure out what to do next. And the idea was, well, let's just see what happens if we put a bunch of people in a room from around the city, many of whom were already engaged in the issue and adamantly opposed Measure Z, and see if they can come up with a different solution, a better solution. So a lot of the people that were involved in that working group, the folks that had just introduced themselves, they were not fans of Measure Z. And we said, you guys get in a room, talk through it. We didn't know if they'd come up with a plan or not. We didn't know. We just tried to answer their questions and give them space to be fellow residents and work through an issue. And in my experience working in over 140 cities in California, it was one of the best citizen-driven grassroots efforts I've seen happen. So you have a lot to be proud of, I think, in Yorba Linda with how they handled themselves. Third goal tonight is to gather feedback about the housing element, the draft element, and concepts behind it. And then finally, it's just promote a culture of civic engagement and understanding. And I've seen a lot of that happen in Yorba Linda. It's gracious behavior, which is only apropos given your tagline here in the city. And this is now our third workshop. We also did a coffee chat. We did an online Zoom webinar, and it's been nothing but really effective disagreement, but effective and thoughtful disagreement that I really embrace. So thank you. We're going to go through a presentation. I'm going to tell you right now, in a trustful exercise of honesty, our presentation is going to take longer than this because there's going to be questions. The Q&A is probably going to take up the entire duration of our evening. We may not get to the community collaboration conversation where we have conversations at our table. We'll see what happens. But my general attitude has been to call an audible. If there's lots of Q&A going on and it's a healthy conversation, I want to let that run as much as possible because I want you to leave this room feeling like we tried to answer every question you have. So fundamentally, what is this housing element? Well, the housing element defines a change in zoning. First of all, I should say it's part of a broader thing called a general plan, which cities must adopt, that addresses things like park planning and traffic planning and where housing is going to go and a bunch of other visions for a community. And the housing element is a particular element that essentially says, here's our zoning that's going to be designed to accommodate a certain amount of growth in the coming period of time. We often talk, you'll hear the term RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment. RHNA number is a number that's determined by our good friends up in Sacramento, and then it's dispersed down to regional governments. In our case, it's called the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, and then SCAG comes up with a math formula to allocate how many housing units, so dwellings, whether that's a condo or a house, need to be built in a given city to meet the future growth needs of the city. And these come in what are called RHNA housing cycles, and that's an 8-year cycle. 8-year cycle that happens, and we are in our 6th cycle. We've adopted these previously, so we're now in our 6th RHNA housing cycle right now, trying to make plans for housing to accommodate that number. What's different this time than the prior times is, number one, our RHNA housing number that this was bestowed upon or forced down onto the city of Yorba Linda is 2,415 housing units. In the prior cycle, the number that was bestowed upon the city was 600 units. So we're at a 400% increase in the number of units. And this happened through fundamentally some political machinations that took place at the Southern California Association of Governments, where folks in the Inland Empire combined with some folks in the city of LA to shift the vote and come up with a formula that removed units from the Inland Empire primarily in LA and put it in a bunch of other places like Orange County. And I think, Nate, how many Orange County, what was our unit count that we ended up in all of Orange County? 180,000 units were assigned to all of Orange County to be built across all the cities. So the county of Orange and all the cities each have a portion of that, and our unit count is 2,415. So that's first big change this cycle. Second big change is there's a lot more aggressive law in place today and more teeth in the rules if you fail to have a housing element. We're going to talk about that in a second, but that's a fundamentally different game. And actually what we're seeing is as legislation continues to come out, we just finished a legislative cycle in Sacramento, there's even more aggressive legislation coming that seeks to potentially punish cities if they are not aggressively managing a housing element and planning for more housing in California. So I will also just note that that 2,400 number is a big number. The city recognized it as a big number. The city made a very aggressive and thoughtful appeal to SCAG to appeal that number and say, this is not fair, this is not right, we shouldn't have this number. That you can watch the video appeal that they made on the Wild Local Control website. It's a very thoughtful video, lays out all the savvy and thoughtful arguments. And ultimately, the committee that reviewed that said, no, sorry, you're stuck with your number. They didn't blink an eye on it. So city made a big, valiant effort to try to battle that. So we are in this phase 2 of engagement. Phase 1 was the working group that got together. 17 members of your community who hashed it out over 6 meetings over down by the library, in 2 different rooms down there over 6 nights to try to talk through these issues and understand the policies and the issues and the challenges and the trade-offs to come up with a recommendation. And ultimately, they made a determination that we need to get some sort of housing element and hopefully one that would be adopted by the residents. So they hashed through that and developed a plan. We're now in phase 2, which is workshops and community engagement, which is going to lead up to a housing element. At this point, it's probably going to be similar to what the working group has recommended. We're still, again, in desire of getting feedback from folks about the housing element itself. That's going to go to Planning Commission at the end of this month. And then within 4 to 6 weeks after that, it'll go to City Council, where the City Council will, theoretically, they could potentially bless it at that point. And if they do, then we take that housing element plan and it goes up to our good friends in Sacramento and HCD, which is the state agency that oversees housing. It's the Housing and Community Development Department. They're going to review that housing element and say yay or nay on its compliance with their standards and expectations. And we may have to tweak it to adjust some of their expectations. We're optimistic that, as it's certainly crafted right now, it would pass muster. And then once that happens, there'll be a whole series of environmental review, which will take us through phase 3, where ultimately we will potentially get to a point where the City Council says, okay, we got a HCD plan, the HCD will approve. We've gotten done our environmental review. We now need to go forward with the process of implementing the zoning to allow for the additional housing development in our community to meet the requirements of this housing element. And when they will then at that time direct a vote to take place, put it on the ballot with a bunch of properties that'll all be rezoned per the housing element. That's where you step in. How many of you are familiar with Measure B? Raise your hand. Okay, half the room. Measure B is a citizen-approved voter initiative that essentially says any zoning changes within certain parameters, so not every zoning change in the city, but many zoning changes in the city must be subject to a majority vote of the residents of the community. And so there's a number of zoning changes that are going to be taking place, or would theoretically take place if it's put on the ballot, that will ultimately have to be approved. That's exactly what Measure Z was back in November. It involved changing some of the zoning on some of the properties that would have helped implement the prior housing element. So in your hands, at the time as registered voters, if you're a registered voter in Yorba Linda, you will ultimately decide whether or not this housing element goes forward. And our job tonight is to give you as much information as possible to A, have thoughts about the housing element itself, and B, to understand the merits of even having a housing element versus a lot of people who say to us in these workshops, just fight Sacramento, beat back. We don't like Sacramento, do what you can to beat them. We're going to talk about that. That's why we have our city attorney in the room. So theoretically, sometime in November of 2024, you will all have a chance to vote on a measure. We don't know what the measure name will be, but assuming it goes to ballot, there will be a chance for you to vote, and it's in your hands. It's not in the hands of staff. It's not in the hands of the City Council at that point. It's in the hands of the voters of Yorba Linda. This is basically the same information, so I'm not going to dwell on this. This is the big question. Why pursue a housing element? This was a big question for our working group. Why pursue a housing element? We're going to dwell on builder's element in a minute here and provide some examples, but fundamentally, how many of you are familiar with builder's remedy? Raise your hand. Okay, half the room again. Builder's remedy is some relatively new law theory that has developed in California, which is now we're seeing implemented and used as a lever throughout cities in California, that essentially says if you do not have a certified housing element, developers can come in and say, we want to develop this piece of property and upzone it to whatever we want, as long as it has 20% affordable units or 100% of it is moderate income affordable. And we can build what we want, which means they can, in our examples we have, they could come in and take a place that's zoned for single family residential units and build a 3-story condo complex. and use builder's remedy to bypass many, not all, but many of the rules that apply in local governments. So builder's remedy, based upon the community conversations we've had, is the biggest concern that drove the working group to say, we really need to do something to prevent builder's remedy from happening. Yorba Linda has yet to have a builder's remedy application, and the reason is right now you have a conditionally certified housing element. HCD conditionally certified it because your staff went out and jumped on it and said, let's go get this done, came out with a housing element plan and got it up to HCD, and HCD said, yeah, this looks good, now go out and get it passed with the voters. And, but they gave us a conditional certification. So we've been inoculated against builder's remedy in this city. If we fail to adopt a housing element in November of 2024, then we expect within 30 days we'll receive official notice from HCD that we no longer have a certified housing element, and then builder's remedy becomes a major risk for the city. And based upon our feedback from the working group and others we've heard from in the community, that's not an acceptable risk. There's other issues though. Fines against the city. We anticipate fines can reach $600,000 a year. $7.2 million a year, that's about half your sheriff's contract budget. So half your public safety services. Just to give you a sense of how big that is. That's a big chunk of your budget for the city. That's not a small number. And I've seen some comments on social media, which is, that's fine, just pay the fines. We're Yorba Linda, we can afford that, we'll pay the fines. The problem is, yes, you can pay your fines, and you still are out of compliance, and you still don't have a certified housing element, and you're still subject to builder's remedy. You don't get to pay your fines and get out of jail on this one. You stay in jail and you're poor. So not a real winning strategy from that perspective. There is the loss of local control where effectively HCD or a judge becomes the arbiter of zoning and permit issuance and whatnot in the city, and they take a lot of that local control away from city staff. And then finally, there's the loss of state grants. And again, this is a money question, but state grants fund, for example, street repairs in your city by remunerating sales tax funds back to the city through the form of state grants to help fill potholes and have your beautiful streets here in Yorba Linda. And those funds also, for example, help fund monies that you use to fund a homeless shelter in Placentia to help you guys address your homeless services needs that you have in the broader northern Orange County region. So those things are all very real and have a real impact on your quality of life. I want to talk, well, actually I'm going to have David talk about builder's remedy now and go through some of the details of what that means and then provide an example of a project and what that could entail.
Okay, so thank you, Ryder. It sounds like most of you have heard of builder's remedy. It's part of the Housing Accountability Act, and it's actually been in the law for a while, but it hadn't been used or tested by developers until recently. And I think what was driving the more current testing of builder's remedy is the fact that so many cities this cycle do not have certified housing elements, and that's a prerequisite for the law actually being an option for developers. As Ryder said, right now the city has a certified housing element, so builder's remedy is off the table, thankfully, and we'd like to keep it off the table. But what is the basics of builder's remedy? Essentially, what it says is in a city that doesn't have a certified housing element, developers are in the driver's seat as far as what they want to develop, and they can bypass a lot of the rules, and one of the most important rules, the local zoning and general plan land use designations of property. So right now we have a lot of low density properties in the city. Yorba Linda's, largely a single family community. We have some multifamily zones. We have some multifamily developments. Some of them are affordable, some of them are not. But largely single family. A lot of the vacant land, what little of it there is left in Yorba Linda, is located on the west side of town where there isn't a lot of multifamily zoning or multifamily development. There's mostly single family. So the other main criteria for eligibility for builder's remedy is that the developer has to provide either 20% of the units that they propose as affordable to lower income persons. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. Or 100% of the units designed and income restricted to persons that fit into the moderate level income category. CEQA still applies, California Environmental Quality Act requirements. They don't get a pass on going through CEQA review, but there are fairly narrow opportunities for cities to deny projects solely on the basis of CEQA compliance. Can we have the next slide, please? So in order to sort of make this a little bit more digestible to folks who aren't that familiar with all this jargon, we thought maybe a local example of how it would play out in the city might be helpful. So the site that many of you may know up off of North Fairmont Boulevard used to be owned by the LDS Church, is actually in our housing element currently as an opportunity site. It's about 23 acres, about 2/3 of it is on a slope, a fairly steep slope leading up to the homes that you see above it. About 1/3 of it is relatively flat or flatter. The existing general plan land use designation of that property is medium residential, which allows 3 dwelling units to the acre. That is typical single family type of general plan land use designation. That is on just the 9-acre portion that is shaded in orange there, or tannish. The upper green portion of the property, that's mostly the sloped portion. It's about 14 acres. It's designated as open space, and in the open space designation, there really isn't any residential contemplated. So there's 2 different sort of frameworks for controlling how land is used. One is the general plan land use, and then the other is the zoning, and they kind of overlap one another. On the zoning side of the equation, the zoning of that property is PD, planned development. Planned development is a customized zone that is really tailored to a particular area. And back in the 80s, the Baldwin Development Company came up with the Yorba Linda Hills Planned Development, which was processed through the city. It covers, when I clipped the map, I didn't take the entirety of it, but it's that northern portion of Yorba Linda, north of Fairmont Boulevard. And it has a number of different types of housing there, including paired homes that are immediately north and east of the Fairmont property. It also has some large single-family properties. This site was actually designated church, hence why it probably was held by the LDS Church for so many years. They recently sold it, though, to a foreign investor, so it's now owned by a developer. And so if it were to develop today, next slide, please, it would have to follow all the rules for those general plan and zoning categories that I mentioned a moment ago. If they wanted to change those, it would require, on the left side of this screen here, a number of things. It would require a zone change in order to modify the planned development plan for that property from church to something else. They'd have to probably change the general plan land use designation, because they probably wouldn't want to develop three units to the acre. They probably would want to increase that. It would be required to go through a design review, which is by the Planning Commission, to review the architectural design and site planning and landscape architecture, et cetera. It would obviously require public hearings at the Planning Commission, which are appealable to the City Council, any decision. Measure B would apply if you upzone property in the city. And of course, under that scenario, the city retains local control. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have the builder's remedy solution, and then sort of all bets are off in many respects. If the city were not to have a certified housing element, we wouldn't be able to deny the project on the basis of inconsistency with the zoning or general plan land use. And as long as they provide the 20% of the units for lower or 100% of the units for moderate, and they comply with CEQA and a couple of other criteria which aren't consequential, they could get rights to develop.
And by rights to develop, they could develop a 5-story, 30-unit per acre condo complex right there, or apartment complex.
They're in the driver's seat, essentially, and we're seeing a number of these types of projects across the state. I think last time Nate checked, there were 59, and I heard today, I was in a meeting with, actually with the developers that built our most recent affordable project right here off of Lakeview, the senior Altrudy senior apartment project. They're out of Orange, and Orange is one of the cities you may have heard that had 2 builder's remedy applications pending. He said that he heard that they have 2 more now, so I think there's 4 in Orange. And the other ones you may have heard of are in La Habra, local examples, and I know that Todd is aware of a project example, builder's remedy project example in Laguna Hills. So there's a number of these in Orange County, and there's a lot more of them in LA County. Santa Monica has been written about quite a bit. I think they had 9 applications. Nate did a quick calculation looking at just the average building height of the builder's remedy applications that have been submitted that we're aware of so far. And I think, wasn't the building height 10 stories on average? Many of them far in a way in excess of 10 stories. So next slide, please. We have just another example of what possibly could happen under a scenario where builder's remedy comes into play. So this is an actual project proposal just across the canyon in the city of Anaheim on property just to the west of the Festival Shopping Center. Salt Development is proposing to do a 76-acre project consisting of about 45 acres of open space, 14 acres of multiple family housing at 7 stories, luxury apartment complex. I think there's 489 units in that. It's kind of nestled into the slope, as you can see the section drawing there. This is something that is pretty scary for us. We don't have anything like this. And then they also have 6 single-family homes proposed. So, and ironically, they call it the Hills Preserve. So, go figure. Anyhow, so that's just kind of a rundown, real-world example, kind of close to home that we think is kind of an eye-opener.
Yeah, and I would just say I'm working in a few communities that are working through these very issues. They're single-family residential primary communities that are dealing with some form of builder's remedy applications now, and it's causes a lot of consternation in the community, I guess is how I would say. And we aren't, we're trying to be pragmatic and realistic with you about what's happening out there. This is a quickly changing space. We're actually trying to, I think within the next couple of days, we should have on the website some articles that are just citations for you to check out at YL Local Control. That'll give you links to LA Times and other platforms that have written pretty extensive articles about some of the projects that are going up around here. So we get a lot of questions too, saying, well, that's great, but you know what? We hate Sacramento, we want you to fight Sacramento. And City Council, from their policy positions and directives to Todd, hasn't disagreed with that point. And we had this conversation with their working group. And fundamentally, the answer is do both. If there's ways to fight Sacramento to help preserve your local control, thumbs up. If there are ways to prevent losing all your local control by failing to have a housing element, then also a good thing to do. And so I wanted to have Todd just speak as the city attorney about what the city council and city have done trying to address lawsuits. And then also importantly, a lot of folks talk about Huntington Beach and what they're up to, and which is a great question. And Todd has some insights on that as well that can be, I think, helpful for context. Take it away, Todd.
So Todd again, still married. So the city has done two things in the attempt to challenge this. And now I'm going to be talking about policy and lawsuits and challenges. Whether you believe the state's policies are a good thing or a bad thing, it doesn't really matter, right? So those are your opinions. We're just trying to give you the information of the reality we are dealing with so that when you vote, you can vote whatever you think is the right way to go. So the challenges that we did, as Ryder initially talked about, there is an appeal process through SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, which is the entity that gives us the number of homes we have to have built or allowed to be built. And we did that appeal process, and it is up on the website. So if you want to see it, you can see it. One of our big arguments in that appeal was that we are in a fire zone, and as odds had it, we filmed our appeal right in the middle of the Brew Ridge fire. So Councilwoman, then Mayor Beth Haney, was the one who gave the video presentation, and then we cut right to, and this is what's going on in our city right now. How can you tell us to build all these homes in these areas? They rejected our appeal. Now, the next question would be, well, can you challenge that rejection of our appeal? And the law is no. About 15 years ago, the city of Irvine, my law firm actually, filed a lawsuit in court saying we should be allowed to challenge this administrative agency's determination. You're taught in law school whenever a right is violated, there needs to be a remedy. We do not have a remedy to this. The court said no. The state legislature took away that remedy, and the administrative ruling is final. So another lawsuit that the city is involved in is with OCOG, which is the Orange County Council of Governments. The City of Yorba Linda is a member agency of that entity. They filed a lawsuit slightly different than a challenge to the RENA number given to the city. They said, oh, no, we're not challenging that. We're going to challenge the number that the state gave to SCAG. So all these numbers start up north in Sacktown and then get sent to all the regional agencies. So we're going to challenge that number. Court said, nope, trial court said you lose. Went to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal said you lose. OCOG has filed something called a petition for review to the California Supreme Court. About 3% of those get granted. This one is not going to get granted. So those were the two efforts we tried legally, both administratively and in the court system, to challenge this. Over the past 5 or 6 years, there have been a number of cases of cities challenging overall state housing laws and whether they preempt local zoning control, particularly in the context of charter cities. In California, there's two types of cities. There's general law cities, charter cities. A charter is just another word for a little local constitution. But in both situations, the courts have consistently said that no, the state law governs cities. Whatever the state law says you have to do, cities, you have to comply with that law. Now, the city of Huntington Beach has put up a valiant effort to try and challenge some of this stuff. There are currently 2 lawsuits pending. I'll get to those in a second. But they've been fighting these issues for the past 5 or 6 years, really, in Huntington Beach. And in the end, they've lost everything. About a month ago, they had to pay $3.6 million to an affordable housing group for losing a lawsuit. They had to pay a couple $100,000 just a month ago in another lawsuit. And there are 2 pending lawsuits. One is the lawsuit that the state filed against Huntington Beach to make them comply with state law. That case was recently transferred down to San Diego because often when cities are in cases, they take it out of that city because they don't want a hometown judge. That will be determined in about a month, but it is my opinion, I may be wrong, that Huntington Beach will lose that lawsuit based upon all the suits that have already happened. The second case is a case by the city of Huntington Beach against the state based on federal principles that they filed in federal court. And in the context of that, the city sought a TRO, which is an immediate temporary restraining order against the state from imposing this law on them. And the federal judge smacked that down in pretty vehement language. And that case is currently under submission. The state filed a motion to dismiss to get it thrown out, which most likely will be granted. And then Huntington Beach is not only gonna have to pay their own attorneys, but then they're likely gonna have to pay attorney's fees to the prevailing parties. So, in my opinion, litigation is not it has not proven to be a viable path to challenge these actions, and really answers are political in the end, right? So, that's my take. Did I cover all?
You did, Todd.
Did anybody have any questions on that? Is that okay, or?
We're going to hold questions just until we get through the presentation. I'd love to try to get there real quick.
I'll be here all night.
Yeah, we're not going anywhere. So real quick, as I had a bunch of members of that resident working group introduce themselves, we had 17 folks who participated. They were from all over these little boxes here, or where they were from. They were spread throughout the city. They didn't cover every neighborhood, but they covered east side, west side, central part, and primarily these were folks who had demonstrated a significant interest in the prior Measure Z, had arguments or concerns about issues, had been actively involved in engaging the city and challenging the housing element, and had demonstrated like they were actively involved in this. So maybe they were high propensity participants in spending umpteen hours in a room discussing housing policy and nerding out with David and Nate and I. So, so we asked if they wanted to be victims, and they said yes, and we did our meetings. There's a 275-page report on the Wild Local Control website that summarizes the housing element plan, which Nate's going to summarize here briefly for you. It summarizes all their goals, their principles, their objective. It was a very thorough document, and that group had unanimous consent, which is very rare when you get 17 people to all agree, but they all agreed unanimously. They consented that this was, to put it in the words of Russ, I think most effectively, the least worst plan we had. Which was, hey, nobody's happy. Everybody had to give up what they could in order to get something that would get us to a housing element. And I don't want to sound dour about it, but I think it's fair to say, nobody walked out of their room saying, crushed it, this is going to be amazing. It was like, okay, we're going to have to take our poison with it, but this is going to get us to a point that everybody's done their fair share. And importantly, they identified some real opportunities as well, which was, what can we do, particularly around putting additional housing down in Savvy Ranch area to create some economic stimulus down there that would create kind of a new downtown 2.0 experience with some higher density housing down in the Savvy Ranch area. So fundamentally what ended up happening as a broad theme is they took the Measure Z status as a starting point, and they said, let's shift 600 additional units out of the west side and out of the central core and shift them more down towards Savvy Ranch. Let's reduce the number of units on 3 particularly sensitive sites, which was Bryant Ranch Center, Christmas Tree, and the Fairmont site. Reduce the density on those pretty dramatically, and then change some other sites around. And Nate's going to summarize this real quick, but fundamentally, that was the general trend of what happened in the working group and how they all kind of said, we got somewhere. With that, Nate, I want to hand it over to you and have you explain the housing element that ultimately was this draft housing element that we're currently taking to Planning Commission, or some version of it, by the end of this month.
Okay, make sure this is working. So in leading up to the Measure Z vote, there was a lot of comments and questions that were coming in at city council meetings, which actually led to several sites that were originally proposed to be part of the Measure Z vote. The council deferred action on those 3 sites and moved forward with 19 other sites. As you know, Measure Z failed, so we got the working group together and asked them about what was working, what sites weren't working. On the east side of the city, the big area where we saw the most number of comments coming in from the public was related to this site, S7001. It's the Bryant Ranch Shopping Center. A lot of concern on the east side of the city was related to fire evacuation. They've been through a number of fires over there, and they had major concerns about adding additional units on the east side of the city, especially when you've got one roadway that's going out. And so the recommendation from the working group on that site was, let's reduce the density on that site, which was previously 35 units to the acre, so that was close to 300 units proposed there. And they said, let's shift some of those units into Savvy Ranch, where there's a little more accessibility to get out during a fire. So you'll see on here there's a new site that's been proposed. One of the other things we heard during these public hearings with at the city council meetings was, why don't you guys use Savvy Ranch? Savvy Ranch is an area that could be utilized to create another downtown type of experience, a mixed use type of setting. We could really revitalize that area. Commercial retail has really changed, and so there could be an opportunity to revitalize that part of the city. So there was a recommendation from the working group to focus, and not just from the working group. We heard this over and over again at the public hearings with the city council as well. Let's utilize Savvy Ranch and add more additional housing there. So that kind of summarizes what was recommended on the east side of the city. On the central side, there's some sites that are shown here in red. Those sites all have existing zoning capacity. They were originally proposed to be rezoned. But there were recommendations to pull those sites off of being rezoned and just utilize the existing zoning capacity that exists there. But the primary area of concern was this S5008 site up on the top. That's the Fairmont site that David was talking a little bit about that site earlier. The original recommendation there was to put 230 units there at a density of 10 units to the acre. There again were concerns. Fire was a big concern on that site as well as protection of open space. And that site, the recommendation was to reduce that down to 30 units total and to move some of those units again out in the Savvy Ranch area. I should point out that one of the other big concerns that the working group raised was a fairness issue. The original Measure Z plan had a lot more of the housing units that were placed on the west side of the city, and there are much fewer units on the east side of the city. And the working group was working together to try and come up with some sort of a compromise that did a more equal balance between who's sharing what portion of this large housing burden that's been placed upon the city. So the Fairmont site did get reduced down, or was recommended to be reduced down, and then we'll jump over to the west side of the city. The west side of the city had a whole bunch of sites that were on there. Many of them were at lower densities, but still a lot of sites were on the west side, and this was a major concern. The biggest concern area from the public hearings and from what we heard from Measure Z vote dealt with the Christmas tree farm off of Richfield. The majority of the comments came there. That site was proposed to be rezoned at 35 units to the acre. And the working group recommended let's bring that down to a 10 unit to the acre density site. And again, shift a lot of those units out into the Savvy Ranch area. Savvy Ranch became a place that was recommended by the working group as a way to have that fairness between the east and the west side of the city. But also the working group was also concerned about putting high density residential next to single family homes. I should point out that the 10 unit to the acre density, that those are 2-story homes. So as much as possible, the working group recommended only putting 2-story home opportunities next to existing single family neighborhoods.
I'm sorry, I know you said no questions, but geographically, in order to understand what you're talking about, I don't know where the dividing line is between east and west Yorba Linda.
So, and this is another good question that the working group even said, what's east versus west? We sort of came up with and said, okay, let's say like from Lakeview, west, it would be western Yorba Linda. We'll say central area would be from like Lakeview east out to like, where do we just, sort of, probably Stonehaven is about where we picked. So it's all kind of relative a little bit, but for some context, hopefully that's helpful. But you can see these red sites are sites that the working group recommended to pull off of the rezoning list and recommended to just leave them with, they all have existing residential zoning capacity that's there. So these sites aren't like completely off of, you know, off of any potential for being developed. They're just proposed to be redeveloped at the existing property rights that exist for those sites. I think that covers most of the problem areas that we were looking at. But again, this table here is intended to show the working group's attempts to try and have a balanced approach between the east side and the west side. And we did have a central portion that's in there. Maybe you consider that west, maybe you consider it east. You know, it's all a little bit relative, but point being, on the far west and the far east sides of the cities, those numbers are much more balanced than they were originally with what was put forward under Measure Z.
I think one thing I would just clarify here is you'll note, if you do quick math in your head, if you add 800 plus 800 but plus 136, you don't get to 2,400. What we're showing here is net changes or increases in zoning density to create additional housing capacity. There's other contributing factors on the next slide that actually get us to the 2,415.
Yeah, so that's a good, so let's jump to the next slide because this is really important as well. One of the other working group recommendations was, let's try and get credit from the state for as much zoning capacity that already exists that doesn't require any sort of rezoning. Let's take credit for as much of that as we possibly can before we rezone anything else. So we started there, and we were able to identify about 759 units worth of property that doesn't require any sort of a rezone. And then from there, that reduced our 2,400 down to a much smaller number to work with, left us a shortfall of about 1,600 units that we needed to find a home for through rezoning. And so that was the effort of working through that. We've got several different types of zoning concepts that are proposed. Savvy Ranch, we talked about that one, would have a higher density type of situation out there with mixed use opportunities out there. There was a desire to look at congregational lands and to see if there's opportunities to allow for housing on church sites. Talked with a number of churches. Many of them, they don't necessarily have any interest in developing, but recognize the city's challenge that they're in and are willing to help with allowing for their properties to be rezoned. And then I think that touches on most everything here. We may come back to it.
About the income categories at this point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what, David, I failed to mention that on the back of this single sheet is actually the income category numbers. So I'll just note,
Sure.
if you have the single-sided that has the examples of lower income housing development in the city, on the back is a very small print chart, courtesy of the government, that is handed to us, that has some data points on it.
So just to clarify, this might help a little bit in reading this chart. So you'll notice that the top row has the columns identified as very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. The RENA number that we got, the 2,415, is broken down by categories, those four categories.
Here's what he's referring to right
Their
now, is that.
income levels. And they're based on the theory that affordable housing costs are a maximum of 30% of your gross income. And the RENA number, and just housing element law in general, is intended to plan not just for affordable housing, but for housing. Just, you know, what is the plan for providing housing within the region, with the idea of having housing opportunities across income categories produced in the marketplace. So what do these different levels mean from an income standpoint? They all tee off of what's called AMI, or average median income for whatever region you're in. We are in Orange County, of course, so the number, AMI number for Orange County just came out last month, and I think it's $127,800 a year for a family of 4, and that's per the chart that is shown on the back of that page that you all have. So there's different percentages of that average median income that are shown on the back of here. Up to 80% of the average median income is considered as qualifying for lower income, lower including the low and the very low categories. So for a family of 4, at the upper end of that range, it says that a family can make up to $114,800. So just to put it in context, we're not talking about homeless housing or anything like that. It's really, a lot of the industry refers to it as workforce housing. Working folks like maybe city planners and people like that.
And I think if I could just put a further point on that, and so their assumption when they look at that formula is 80% of the AMI is about, for a family of 4 to be paying rent of $2,800 a month. That's the upper bound, right? I mean, there's lower bounds certainly, and desire to make other housing more affordable.
Sure, so 30% is
30%
about 18,
of that income.
2,800, yep. So the moderate is the range from 80% to 120% of that figure. And then above market or above moderate is market rate housing. So whatever developer wants to build. So just wanted to clarify that point so that you can understand this chart a little bit better.
So one thing that's kind of interesting about all this as a policy basis is the RHNA housing allocation number we got of 2,415 units. That ultimately was a math formula that SCAG put together. The allocation of the total number of units that Southern California had to plan for was a math formula devised by HCD. And then within this, the methodology for how they allocate this was all a standard math formula that basically said these are the categories you need to build to, right? Or you need to allow for construction. And to be 100% clear, city does not build anything. It's all about market forces. So we could do all this zoning, and then if there's a massive recession in the real estate industry for the next 10 years, you could surmise that probably not a lot's going to get built. As a fellow homeowner, I wouldn't be excited about a massive real estate implosion, but nothing would get built. Also, to be clear, that's not me saying, don't worry guys, nothing's going to get built. If we zone, something will get built. Will it get built within 1 year? All of it? No, it's going to take time, but over the duration of the period, if we're going to zone for it, developers are going to pursue profit, they're going to want to build, it will get built. So, just so we're all clear, nobody from the city is telling you it's not going to get built. Assume it'll get built if we zone it. So fundamentally, this is a table I put up of facts and information with the working group, and at the conclusion of our second or third meeting together, and I said, can we all at least agree on these facts? Because if we're going to have a conversation, you need to at least agree on facts to move forward. So I'd like you to just take a minute and dwell on these facts, and if you have a disagreement about one of these facts, I'd love to engage in a robust discussion about them and make sure I'm not missing something. But these are the facts we operated under. They're the operating facts that working group used in order to devise a plan and come up with a strategy and talk through this issue. I will also just note this last one about a citizen effort for a statewide ballot measure. Some of you may have heard of something called Our Neighborhood Voices. It's one of a few groups out there that are pushing for more local control initiatives. A lot of that is a response to a lot of the housing policy issues and mandates, frankly, that are coming down from Sacramento. According, at least to what I've heard and what I've heard from some folks who are directly involved with that working group, that initiative's now been pushed back till 2026. So I'm now 100% confident that this last one is not going to happen by the time we need to be in a position to theoretically give you a chance to vote yes or no on adoption of a housing element with a November 2024 ballot measure. So there is no white knight of a initiative process at this time at the state level that's going to eliminate these state housing mandates. Any questions on these facts? And yeah, real quick, sorry, since we're recording time, Sarah Matson here is going to play Phil Donahue, or Phyllis Donahue, as the case may be. And she's going to hold a microphone and put it in front of your face so we can capture the audio recording. So, Matson?
I'm just curious, if the current owner of the property does not want to sell it to a developer to do this, can they be forced to sell their property?
No.
No.
No, you are not forced.
So I'm slightly naive to all this stuff, but there's all the issues of when you build, you have to think about traffic and electricity and power and water and sewage and fire and traffic and et cetera, the desirability of the neighborhood and so forth. How does this tie to those critical things? Because I've seen cities that have run ahead of their shoelaces, built, and they didn't have the sewage capacity, or they didn't have the fire or police or whatever. And we're already having, home break-ins left and right and fire issues and so forth. And how does this tie to a city's ability without them becoming an unincorporated area, which I guess is an option? You have to build that stuff before you can do this other stuff, right?
Yep, that's a great question. So I will answer a couple of those things and get a little bit over my skis, and then I'm going to get saved by the two housing nerds over here. So fundamentally, from HCD's perspective, they're not particularly concerned with those realities. And I would generally say with policy issues up in Sacramento, they aren't particularly concerned with those realities either. So for example, there was a piece of legislation about 5 years ago that allowed every residential unit in a single family residential unit, you could do a lot split and then put a duplex on that lot split, right? So if you live where you live right now, this zoning exists. There have been no applications in Yorba Linda to make that happen, but that law existed. And when local governments challenged that law, they basically said, we built sewer infrastructure for single family residential housing, say 100 housing units. There's now theoretically 400 housing units allowed where the 100 were before without any sewer upgrades. How's that supposed to work? And there was no policy response to that, right? It was like, yeah, well, we'll figure it out. So similarly, there's lots of concerns about fire risk. There's an upcoming workshop. We have a flyer in the back for it that we're having a whole conversation about fire evacuation routes and fire risk here. We're very aware of the fire risk. As was said, when they were in the middle of the appeal for the fire, for the RHNA housing number, there was a fire going on the hillsides. That was not a concern. The fire risk issue is not a concern. Getting housing insurance is not a concern when it comes to the mandate and the policy. Now, some could argue this is just a sign of one hand of government not even talking to the other side, and therefore they're just running in different routes. That may be true. Our reality is we're trying to contend with this. Now, the city is doing its best to plan as it can. There are developer impact fees that put in certain infrastructure to fund some of this. Not to mention those developer impact fees also help build new schools and can fund parks and other infrastructure in the city. So there's some upside to some of this development. I'm not saying that's the reason to do it, but there is some of that element to it. You got any other comments you want to clarify on what I just said?
Yeah, I'll just add, great question, and I think it's important to emphasize that the concerns we've been talking about developers being able to bypass the rules and build what they want kind of thing doesn't exclude them from complying with all of the objectively measurable health and safety requirements that are normally applicable. So you still have to go through building department and engineering department and prepare civil drawings and architectural plans that meet all of the building codes and everything else. Cities just can't deny the right to develop on the basis of some of the softer regulations like zoning and general plan land use. And customarily development is supposed to pay its own way, and so there are a number of development impact fees that are applicable whenever you build new development. If the infrastructure is inadequate, they are on the hook to upgrade it. If they're upgrading it and providing additional capacity, then they have to pay the full boat on putting that infrastructure in. Sometimes there's reimbursement agreements if the vacant land down the street later develops and takes advantage of that upgraded infrastructure, but not always. The other point that I was going to make is that there is this California Environmental Quality Act requirement in California, and the idea behind that is to look before you leap and do an analysis of the impacts of development before you move forward, before a city decides, hey, yeah, great idea, approved. You have to go through an extensive environmental review process and look at a number of categories. A lot of them are related to the capacity of utilities and infrastructure, among like numerous other categories, including traffic capacity and environmental impacts like air quality, greenhouse gases, biology, open space. All of these things are categories under a CEQA compliance review.
Hang on one second. Let's get a microphone to you.
Okay, so David, I wonder if you can comment too, because we had a lot of discussion in the group about the traffic flow issues with Savvy Ranch, and I know that we talked last time and that there is some potential for upgrade there.
Thank you, Nancy. So I think that when people started saying, hey, let's put it in Savvy Ranch, there was a lot of energy that kind of wanted to, let's put it all in Savvy Ranch.
Yeah, Savvy can solve everything.
We said, wait a minute. You know, Savvy Ranch is kind of our premier business park community, and there's also a really important retail center down there that has a lot of public dollars invested in it. Some of you may remember many years ago, we were kind of last to the party and it didn't quite work out, but we tried to put in an auto plaza down there, and the city spent a lot of redevelopment dollars to put infrastructure in there to kind of pave the way for an auto plaza. And we got a couple of auto dealers that went in down there for a period of years, but then it kind of fizzled out. And I think, like I said, we were a little late to that party. But then we got this retail center. Majestic Realty built the big box retail center, and Home Depot was there initially, and then they left us, got stolen from us, and went to Anaheim's side of Savvy Ranch. But then we got Kohl's and a number of big boxes down there. And so that whole retail world has changed, as everyone knows, and we're trying to figure out, how to address that issue, which is, kind of a paradigm shift across the country and perhaps the world. So that's a problem. But that generates, or did generate, quite a lot of tax revenue to the city that pays for city services and parks and roads and all the good stuff that we need in order to have the nice place that we have here. So the other factor that was at play related to the question of how much new development can we put down at Savvy Ranch was the capacity for traffic. And there's a concept in traffic engineering called level of service at an intersection. And it's a scale from A to F, F being like gridlock and A being really good, like nobody on the street. The city accepts, in most cities, probably every city accepts level of service D as sort of the least level of functionality that they consider acceptable. Right now, at peak hour in Savvy Ranch, because everything kind of flows out a bottleneck at Savvy Ranch Parkway and Weir Canyon, there is quite a bit of congestion at that intersection, especially after the Costco gas station went in a few years ago. You guys know about that. Yeah, probably deal with it on a regular basis. The geometrics of Savvy Ranch are also difficult. It's kind of a cul-de-sac on both sides and just kind of a weird cloverleaf situation. We've made improvements to it over the years. It's gotten a little better. But in 2015, we did a more extensive look at both land use and mobility in Savvy Ranch and came up with some ideas. It's called a vision plan. In order to try to get some additional relief down there. And there were 3 levels of traffic improvements that were considered sort of near-term, low-level improvements, moderate-term, medium-range improvements, and then sort of like 30-year vision, really long-term, kind of pie-in-the-sky improvements. And I'll just say what those were. It was a bridge across the river to La Palma, which kind of creates another cul-de-sac in a way because La Palma has very limited access as well. The other option in that level was kind of a frontage road along the 91 freeway from farther east down by the campgrounds. But these moderate range improvements are underway right now, and they're in design, and we're working with the city of Anaheim, and they're going to add a lane to the Weir Canyon Bridge and add 2 lanes to the left and right turns at the intersection of Savvy Ranch Parkway and Weir Canyon. And that's going to provide quite a bit of improvement to the congestion situation down there, better than probably level of service D. It'll probably be a high C. So that gives us some additional residual capacity in Savvy Ranch for development. So before the working group considered how much housing could be accommodated down there, we did some additional traffic analysis, and we asked the traffic engineering firm, which was LSA, by the way, to look at what the residual capacity would be if we assumed those improvements were in that I talked about a moment ago, and also assumed that all of that retail square footage, all that big box retail square footage was factored in at a level that is more consistent with, you know, a more vibrant sort of old school retail level before kind of COVID and probably before the major shift in sort of retailing from brick and mortar to more e-commerce. So we think it was a conservative analysis, and what the results said is that assuming those things, you could get an additional 850 units down there without upsetting the apple cart and maintaining at least the minimum standard that the city has, which is, again, level of service D, at the intersection of Savvy Ranch Parkway and Weir Canyon. So that's kind of where we landed on this number of 800 units of capacity. And one final sort of, I guess, governing factor of how much housing you can put down there is HCD's sort of willingness to tolerate an overconcentration of housing units in one area, particularly an area right next to a freeway. For years, in housing element world, cities would oftentimes try to push their affordable housing requirements to the edges and maybe over by the railroad tracks kind of thing. And there's this new concept in housing element law called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And in a nutshell, it strives to, or wants cities to strive to include folks of all income levels within the entirety of the community and not sort of push them out to the edges. It's an inclusionary kind of requirement, and include, you know, diverse folks throughout all communities kind of thing. And so HCD doesn't really approve the old practice of pushing everything to the edge. And so before we brought back, you know, sort of the parameters to the working group, we reached out to HCD and said, hey, we're thinking about this, or our working group is thinking about it. And we kind of talked through it with them and got a preliminary okay from them. And the reason I think we did is because we've had some success down there already with some housing projects, the Oak Crest Terrace, Oak Crest Heights projects. And we talked about it to them in a way that where we kind of talked about it in the context of this larger vision of creating a mixed use kind of downtown 2.0 idea that we talked about earlier. And that is not new information to HCD. It's very current We're seeing this happen all over former retail areas, malls that have kind of been converted in part or fully to housing. Bellaterra is an example, the Orange Mall.
Mission Viejo also has a project
Yeah,
doing that.
it's pretty common. So they could wrap their head around it, and they said, okay, well, yeah, it sounds good. Go forth and make it so, kind of thing. So we're hoping that they don't change course when we actually give it to them in writing, which can happen, but we're hopeful that they will live up to their word. And they did give us some fairly warm feedback on the idea anyways.
Do they know it's 800 plus units?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
The question for the recording is, do they know it's 800 plus units? The answer is yes. Make sure we get a microphone in front of you because I want to make sure we capture this audio.
Question for the city attorney. Huntington Beach is challenging the state numbers of housing required per city, and they're arguing that that formula is not looking at realities. Do you think that there'd be a chance then that the state will reduce or admit that, or at least acknowledge that in the lawsuit, so we can have a lower requirement of homes for the state plan? Thank you.
The question was, will the state revisit the number that was instituted this cycle? That was
Based on the Huntington Beach lawsuit?
right. No, the state will not revisit any of that. There have been, for lack of a better term, audits of that number put out by what's the entity up at Stanford that? The Embarcadero Group. Yeah, the Embarcadero Group, which showed how that number is exceedingly high. So that information that the number's likely too high has already been out there and been presented to Sacktown, and it hasn't changed anything, unfortunately.
Hands up.
You mentioned we already have a certified housing element that includes some number of homes, and yet none of those have been built. Are the places where those homes are going to be built part of this diagram, or are there some other green and little green areas that we haven't been talking about?
Right. So for just one clarifying point, we have a conditionally certified housing element, which is this one, and Nate can speak to what of the, in the context of this, we need to talk about that RENA housing cycle, start date for that, where it is as well.
Yeah. So the sixth cycle RENA, this sixth housing cycle that we're talking about here runs from 2021 through 2029. And it's kind of a two-step process. It starts with your housing element where you come up with your plan for what you intend to do as far as rezoning property. And that's what the state looks at, and they certify that and say, that looks good, now go rezone it. So step 2 is to actually rezone it. And that's the part where the voters in Yorba Linda get an opportunity to say whether they support that or not. So we have a certified housing element currently.
Conditionally certified housing.
Conditionally certified. And it's only really conditionally certified through the next election. And we anticipate that if that fails, that our conditional certification will likely be. So the reason it's conditional is because you're required to implement the zoning. You have 3 years to implement the zoning that's established within your housing element in order for it to become, like, once your zoning has been put in place, now you're fully certified. It's conditional because the state has said, your housing element, we're certifying this on the condition that you rezone these properties, and if you don't, we're going to pull away that certification. So essentially, what was in the conditionally certified housing element is what, for the most part, is what was presented to the voters, less three or four sites that were removed. The working group has been working on making recommendations to revise that plan, and that plan will be presented to HCD at some point once we've done all of our public input process.
So I want to go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, and just to wrap that point home, I mean, part of the conditional nature of it is because of Measure B, right? Because HCD is cognizant of the fact that in Yorba Linda we have this local voter approval requirement. So in our housing element, they said, okay, Yorba Linda, you're conditionally certified, but it has to be approved by the voters. You get the first chance in 2022, and then the second chance is the presidential election next year in 2024.
So there's a clarifying point though, because I want to make sure we're clear on her answer, because it's a little confusing. 2021, the cycle started, right? Yeah. And houses have been getting built in the city. So we have some houses that are already building towards the RHNA housing number. Is that correct?
Correct.
But that was using existing zoning that was already in place, correct?
Correct.
Is that getting you more answers that you're after?
Yes, and is that the 2,415 units?
So the 2,415 units are units we have to accommodate the construction of between 2021 and 2029. And so some of those units have already started getting constructed, so we're towards that number so far. Okay. I'm all the way in the, oh, was there one up here? Sorry, your choice, whoever you saw first.
Could you please explain to us the density bonus and the 30% bonus that alleviates setbacks, and could that be used on the 200 units on Baston Cherry?
Sure. So density bonus is a state law that basically says that if a developer comes in and wants to propose a certain level, a certain percentage of affordable housing on a project site, that the state law allows for them to request certain waivers from certain development standards within the city. So that's a state law that's granted. There's lots of other bad news state laws that are out there as well. But to answer the question specifically, how would that address?
Okay, I wanted to know, and there's a 30% bonus, correct? So they can build over 200 at that point if they allow some high density. I mean, some low income.
Yeah, there would have to be a certain percentage of units, and if you're referring to the, there's a chart that's in state law.
It would be like 40 units, okay, on the Baston Cherry site, correct?
I'd have to go and refer to the chart. Okay. There's a chart that outlines how many units have to be dedicated or deed restricted, essentially, at certain affordable housing levels in order for state density bonus law to kick in.
But I think to your point, the answer is the bonus density exists on development, generally speaking, on any development, even as we sit here right now on any development.
We would have no setbacks.
Not necessarily no setbacks, but I think it's important to point out that, David, in our history, have we had any density bonus projects that have come through?
No, not to increase the density. A project qualifies that provides affordable units, can qualify for waivers whether they provide additional density or not. And in Yorba Linda, through the last 2 cycles that I've been involved in, the properties that developed in Yorba Linda actually developed at a lower density than the allowable maximum. Even the projects down in Savvy Ranch that are 100% affordable. They didn't take advantage of the density increase that's allowable under density bonus law, although they did take advantage of certain waivers and deviations that are allowed. One of which in the Oak Crest Terrace project, I think we had a development standard that required a certain percentage of the site to be dedicated for active open space. And given just the available site area for development, they couldn't meet that standard. So they asked for a waiver from the open space standard. I think it was, by some percentage. But the vast majority of the prior housing element sites developed at a lesser density than the maximum that was allowed. And when we talked to developers at that time, they said that the reason is because there's a sweet spot in Yorba Linda, and it's, kind of at that time it was around a $700,000 price point or $800,000 price point. And so the projects Many of them that developed came in at below what the maximum density would have allowed. So, for what it's worth, doesn't mean that every project did, or that every project in the future would, or that density bonus to increase the number of units couldn't or wouldn't happen in Yorba Linda. I'm just sharing with you what the experience has been in Yorba Linda to date with actual developments that have come forward. Developers like to build townhomes in Yorba Linda rather than, massive apartment projects, and a for sale type of project seems to be the predominant market-driven approach. So,
thank you for raising the question on the bonus density, because it's a fair one, and that law's existed. I feel like that law's been on the books for a long time that law's been around. And I think partly what I'm just hearing in some from David is that the market dynamics in Yorba Linda have never really favored the bonus density being opted for by private development, but that's entirely a market function. If I could predict the market, I'd be an economist.
Does that impact the setbacks, though?
Under the waivers that are contemplated in density bonus law, again, you have to, there's a list of different types of waivers, and I believe setbacks are one of them. So, yes, parking is another one, building height, yes.
All right, question in the back.
I just want to make sure I didn't misunderstand. I believe, Nate, did you just say that the working group, what is being presented, is that what is set in stone? Or did you say the working group was still working on it?
So the working group came unanimous. In order to have something to bring to the community, we had to ask the working group to come up with a plan. So they came up with unanimous consent on a plan that was negotiated among themselves with information and math formulas provided by Nate and David to piece together parcels to get to the number count of 2,415. We're still actively in this process, seeking community feedback and ideas. We've had feedback on some sites where concerns were expressed about the density that was showing up there. So we welcome any of that feedback and encourage it. What I also encourage in that feedback process, since we are fundamentally dealing with math and we're asking you as fellow residents to come up with solutions, is that if you're going to say, I don't like this spot here, please don't rezone and upzone it, and that's going to drop 100 units out of the formula, help me find 100 units somewhere else. What other property is going to get developed to achieve that? That's the kind of yin and yang of the scenario that we're facing, because you push it on one part of the balloon, it's going to come out somewhere else. Is there a follow-up question?
I know that what the working group did was really difficult. I know there had to be a lot of give and take. I understand from listening tonight that we're talking about equality. East, I know in general, I know there's a central Yorba Linda, but we're talking east and west. And the numbers are pretty much east 868, west 821 approximately. So this idea of like, we're sticking it all in Savvy, I get it, but I would suggest that rather than we're looking at east, we're looking at these sort of vertical lines when we're looking at a map. If you look at Yorba Linda and look at a north-south, if you cut it this way, I think that the conversation needs to be had is that when you say Savvy Ranch, I'm basically east. So that La Palma Boulevard, the city acknowledges our fire danger, and it's real, and yet we still have sites directly on our evacuation route. Now, if that big fire comes through and fire trucks are turning us around, you're shooting us up La Palma, and now you're potentially putting 800 more dwellings at Savvy Ranch, getting us to that exact same spot. 1, 2, 3, 4 extra lanes is not really going to facilitate that. So for those of us on my end of the world here in Yorba Linda, we're still in a very vulnerable situation, and it is not about we don't want it here. I'd say if you look at the map and you divide it vertically, Savvy Ranch is where we buy our milk, our groceries. We have no closer grocery store. So basically, those 800 units are in our backyard. That's where I get gas. That's where I get bread. So now I still have 78 units on my evacuation route, and I have, when you're gonna shoot me out, because Gypsum Canyon Bridge is a parking lot, and we have a huge cemetery potentially. All of those things are in the same pot. So we can't, if this is it, I would say that the people on my end of the woods are going, I don't see it.
So, first of all, thank you for that feedback, and many of the working group members heard that feedback. I'll just observe that the fire risk conversation was a part of the discussion about how to mitigate and address that as part of the conversation. So, doesn't mean we had an end-all solution, and that will be part of the Planning Commission discussion as well as the City Council when they go to review these things. So I appreciate that feedback, and it's something we have to chew on from a policy perspective. Who's next? Go ahead. Sorry. I was saying, go ahead, Sarah.
Did I hear you say something about you'll think about the fire, or it was hard for me to hear her, because this fire problem is a big problem. And I was in the area where in 2008, I don't know, I talk loud enough anyway, but I'm off of Stonehaven, I'm on Heather Ridge Drive, okay? So I was one of the first owners there. My husband has since passed. But someone the lawyer or somebody said, well, they don't care about this or that, about the density, and I was reading your notes on the computer about the density and wild places, you know, for the animals, and you cannot build there. That's what I read. Is that correct?
You can't build where?
You cannot build in these particular areas. That was in your communication that I had. It showed a map and it had the density. And of course, my house is backed right up to the canyon. No, it's not in this. I didn't read it. It's on the computer. When I came here, it was in the about density areas. Like you couldn't go into Chino, or you know, it had the wild places, preserves and all this. And it said density, something about fire areas. And when we did have the fire, we're lucky nobody died in that thing, because once you went down Agua, my neighbor had to get the traffic out of there, and I left early to go to Vaughn's. And I don't want to go on and on, but I'm just telling you, this is a major problem. And my company's Embers Out, and we provide the, you know, all of the vents for these areas, for these houses. And they have got to really consider this, because this is like paradise. You know that place up there, I think, and it's no joke, because my neighbor said, Penny, nobody was down there to direct the traffic. It was stopped from the freeway, as you probably already know. And that has to be considered, because it's a death trap. And when I went by Savvy Ranch, and the Catholic school over there, with all the people coming in and out, the traffic pattern has to be figured out, or else we'll all be responsible for deaths at the end, because this is going to happen again, because we're not doing any burning in the canyon. And then they went and built the homes over by Agua, which I was shocked that they got away with it. The thing is, people can't get insurance now. So if people can't get insurance, then they're not going to get these homes. They're not going to, and so the builders, they act like they want to do all this building and everything. It is going to come to a little bit of a halt as things go on. So this is what I wanted to say. Unless if you were in the fire and 9 houses burned on my street, you have no idea how terrifying that is.
So first of all, I wasn't in the fire, and you're right, I don't have any idea. And I think that what you're referring to that I said earlier is, even though we were making an appeal to HCD about our fire risk here, HCD did not care.
Well, they will at some time, because when the insurance company and the money, that's when it's going to start.
So I'm not going to argue with you about this. I get your point, but I'm just saying from the perspective of the appeal, that wasn't a significant concern. And we certainly have already seen in Orange County where there is development, like down by Rancho Mission Viejo. There is housing that came to a halt in construction because they suddenly realized they couldn't get homeowner insurance. If you can't get homeowner insurance, you can't finance a house. And in some ways, In some ways, it actually is finally a market force telling the market, stop building houses in the wildland urban interface, right? Like in some ways, that's probably how the market should work. So I would also just say the city is very aware of fire risk issues. They have a huge forum they're doing here shortly on this fire risk issue. I'm sure you're going to be at that forum as well.
But that's why it was sort of what somebody said up here, well, they don't pay attention to that. You need to pay attention to it. I heard that.
I said that about HCD. I didn't say that about the City of Yorba Linda, to be clear.
Yeah, if I could just, and Ms. Penny, I was part of the fire recovery team back in 2008. It was a horrendous fire, and Heather Ridge was hit hard. I know a number of your neighbors that they have new homes now. Well, we lost 118 homes during the Freeway Complex fire. It was horrendous, tragic fire. I don't want to put words in our current public safety leaders' mouths, but I think if we were to ask our police chief, Joseph, he would say at that time, Brea PD was the police agency for the city, and now the Orange County Sheriffs are in charge, and they approach evacuation much more conservatively, and they, I think, proved that during the Blue Ridge fire. We only lost one home during the Blue Ridge fire. Of course, there were other contributing factors to that positive outcome this time, of course. But the other point that I would just make is your concern is very concerning to your city officials. And in fact, we are just completing now an update to all of our emergency evacuation planning. And our emergency evacuation managers are rolling out community meetings related to wildfire preparedness and evacuation. And the next community meeting is scheduled for the 26th of this month at Santa Clara de Assis Church. You may have gotten a card in the mail. There's flyers in the back for it. I would encourage everyone that has an interest in this topic, and probably everyone does, to attend that meeting and find out how the city's evacuation protocols have changed. And I feel, again, speaking on behalf of our first responders, they're going to say that they feel very comfortable about being able to address these types of threats moving forward. And so just wanted to make that comment.
All right.
Yeah, hi. This is to address the woman who lives on Heather Ridge. I live off of Villa del Agua, down the hill from you, and very aware of the 2008 fire because we also lost homes on our streets as well. As a member of the working group, well, first of all, let me just say that another group that I belong to is the Protect Our Homes and Hills group that worked very hard over the last 10 years to try to limit the building of homes in that area. We were unsuccessful in our lawsuits to keep the Esperanza Hills development or the Cielo Vista one, which you are now seeing being built. But as a member of the group, one of the things I need to say is that if we don't vote for this and we get builder's remedy, that will allow for them to build whatever they want on those properties, Esperanza Hills, and all of the land from over on the west side all the way east that borders Chino Hills State Park. That is now privately owned. You can see it in the map. You'll see the Yorba Linda border when he shows it in the map there. The border of Yorba Linda, everything below that, that's open space. That's not owned by the city. It's privately owned. So it means that anybody could come along. It's now zoned open space, but somebody can come along and build in that if builder's remedy then becomes the law of the land. So think carefully about your vote in November. Thank you.
There's another question.
So I totally agree. I think there is a safety issue in Yorba Linda. I mean, we're all concerned about fire and evacuation, but we're also concerned about the current traffic and the existing issues. So I heard we address Savvy Ranch, but what about Lakeview? Lakeview between Yorba Linda and Mariposa. I mean, particularly. I mean, that is congested as well. It's a small, old 2-lane street. So, and then we have Eureka, there's Richfield. I mean, there's many old, small 2-lane streets within the west side of Yorba Linda. So where's the improvement or infrastructure enhancement for these streets? There's not even adequate sidewalks. None are ADA compliant at this time. You can't go walk up. There's cars parked on the sidewalk of Lakeview. There's trash cans on the sidewalk of Lakeview because it's so small. Everybody's scared that their cars or their trash cans will get hit, their cars are going to get hit, which I understand has been quite increased with all the traffic. So what are the plans for the west side and infrastructure on the streets?
Good question. Nate, you got any comments to make on that?
Sure. So I guess first and foremost, appreciate the concern. These are things that are addressed to, at least to a certain extent, through the California Environmental Quality Act. So there was a what's called an environmental impact report that was prepared that looked at the last housing element sites. That'll have to be updated with whatever new sites are proposed, and it'll look at a very high level what sorts of traffic impacts in particular, as well as a number of the other impacts that David had mentioned, how those will be impacted from any development that might occur. Now, as projects are developed on an individual basis, each one of those projects has to go through its own environmental analysis, and any impacts from that development, they would have to take care of their fair share of covering the cost of whatever upgrades need to happen to the infrastructure in those locations. So essentially, what we're looking at right now is we don't know exactly what a property owner might develop on their property, and we won't know that until if and when they decide to move forward with something. We can analyze it at a high level right now, but that'll be analyzed again at a project level, specific project level, when that project is proposed to come forward.
So what I'm hearing you say is, let's say there's a parcel that's going to get developed near the street. If it's currently would end up as zoning for 100 housing units to be developed, a developer comes in and says, I'm only going to do 70 because this is what the market is telling me I want to build. Again, that's not me saying people won't do it. I'm just giving a theory. Then there'll be a sequel analysis done on the traffic impacts of 70 houses or 70 units. And theoretically, that may include some mitigation work that has to be done on the street that would otherwise be funded by the development in order to support that mitigation?
That's correct.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Andre Weinbar, and I'm representing the Estancia community. Specifically, we're opposed as a community to the density that's being suggested on the Bastion Cherry site. I'd love to know how members of my community can engage with the 17-member of the community to talk through that density. Obviously, many of the community members today have expressed concerns around fire. We also share those concerns. I can't put a palm tree in my backyard, and my house specifically backs up against where these 200 units are being suggested. It's hard for me to rationalize how fire considerations are not being paid more attention to, in addition to the density that's occurring on Bastion Cherry already. Will just exacerbate. So I'm really interested in how I can engage, and members of my community can engage with the 17-member panel to talk through how we can lower that density specifically on the Bastion Cherry site.
So first thing, many of those folks are in this room tonight, and raise your hand, working group members. So feel free to talk to any one of those fine folks. Number two, Planning Commission is there's a working group. The working group did a yeoman's job as volunteer citizens, right? Ultimately, the final policy say is with City Council on what happens, and they vet some of that through Planning Commission as well. Their starting point is the working group material, and given the delicate process I saw unfold to get to where we were, there was a lot of giving and taking on where units ended up. Hence that whole point I just made about drops units here, where else are you gonna add them? If we drop 100 units off the sanctuary, where else are they gonna end up going? What's the suggestion? So there were some extensive conversations that took place around that, which is to say, if there's a better idea, I'm sure the working group would love to hear it, the planning commission would love to hear it, ultimately the city council would love to hear it. And it's good to have those concerns noted. I think it's fair to say for the working group members, fire risk was a component of our overall discussion. Fundamentally, the challenge that we're also facing and all that is, as much as Yorba Linda is concerned with that, and your elected officials and your city staff, HCD's concern is less significant, and we're trying to thread that needle as best as possible. Do you have a follow-up comment?
Can we go to the slide that, because there's also, the city has an email address. I think it's one of the slides.
It's right here.
Yeah, right here. So if you want to reach out to city staff, talk with the working group members, that's great. If you'd like to reach out to city staff, please visit our website, but also there's an email address there. That email address will go to us, and we'll take certainly any input that you have on the plan. And happy to talk, if you guys want to meet separately and come in and chat in person with just your community to talk through things, happy to do that too.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I'm waiting for Sarah to get me to a person. Pick one.
So glad to hear all this healthy discussion.
She'll hold the mic for you. Don't worry about it.
I just want to raise a slightly different perspective. A lot of us choose this community because it's a beautiful natural habitat. After all, Yorba Linda is a bird sanctuary. And as we build taller buildings, birds don't see glass as solid objects. New York City has a cleanup crew every night that picks up all the dead birds that run into the buildings. As you begin to build 10-story buildings with glass, you begin to kill the raptors and the other beautiful birds, the goldfinches and stuff that fly around here. And I think that may be another avenue of opposition to excessive development that we should look at. These environmental sort of impacts that can really begin to degrade the natural beauty of this community.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that comment.
Ryder, can you go back to the table? I think this is important to this comment, and some other people, this might help. So when we talk about building height, I think it's really important to understand that most of these zones that are here are 2-story height limit. There are some that allow for a 3rd story, and there's so I think when we're talking 10-story, what I would say is that the local plan that the city is proposing has a much lower height limit than a builder's remedy project would be able to have. So I think it's important to understand that we can control building height through a local plan. We cannot control building height if the plan is rejected.
And I think our estimate on height limit or height was that the highest construction would be in Savvy Ranch, which had the highest density. Is that a fair statement?
Correct.
And we're tops, that's probably 5 stories, or?
We talked about a 5-story residential height limit there.
So that would be the cap out for down there in Savvy Ranch.
Yeah, so I'm looking at a page from the housing element, and the region tells Yorba Linda a certain percentage of each income level that they must build. So for very low income, it says 32%. So how does that 32% get placed on particular sites? And how do you make the builder comply with building that type of unit?
So that's a phenomenal question, because ultimately the city's not in charge of building any of this. It's a market response to get there. And the state is setting guidelines and goalposts for us to get there. I'm going to let one of our housing experts answer that. Nate the Great's going to answer that one. And keep that microphone really close to your mouth, because it's not very hot.
Let me touch on just a couple things here. So first and foremost, one of the first areas where we tried to get as much credit in the lower income arena was, you can see up here under accessory dwelling units, every single residential property is allowed to have an ADU per state law. In fact, you can have 2. You can have one ADU and one JADU, which is a junior ADU. You can see up here that we got credit for 100 very low and 172 low-income units with ADUs. So that's where some of those units would be coming from. You can see on the chart here it breaks down under very low and low where we're getting credit for those units. And it's important to understand that just because we're getting credit for it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the developer will build. We can't force the developer to build. We can set the parameters under which they can build, but we can't force them to build anything specifically. They could be well, when you say those, it depends on which one
Anything
you're
could
pointing
be
to.
an apartment, anything could be a condo, anything could be a house.
We can't control what structure they do, what whether it's we can identify the parameters. You can build condos, you can build a single family home, you can build townhomes, and they choose from within that within those rules.
What do you consider affordable for low income?
I'm sorry?
A purchase of a home, what do you consider the price for low income? And what do you consider the price for moderate?
So,
because all I'm hearing is apartments. Because you're saying rent. That's all I've been hearing is rent. So low income, what price house is affordable?
It's all
What price house is moderate?
This all goes
right now. They're trying to fit a round sub, in a square hole.
So,
because, I talk to bankers and stuff. They say median prices here in Yorba Linda, you got to make $150,000, $170,000 a year, and none of this stuff in here qualifies for that. So I mean, I don't get it.
that's so, part of the conundrum here.
It doesn't fit here in Yorba Linda.
Well, so I think one thing to, so first of all, if I could just clarify point 2, if we just give us a second here to try to answer the question that was originally asked, if you don't mind. So first of all, Nate, could you just talk about density and how that relates to what's deemed like creating the circumstances for lower income housing?
So the state has this law that's called default density. And what that means is that there are certain densities that automatically qualify towards meeting your lower income RHNA credit. And that default density is typically a minimum density of 30 units to the acre. We were able to get the state to allow for us to get credit for our lower income RHNA through an overlay housing program that has a minimum density of 20 units to the acre and a maximum of 35 units to the acre. So let me give an example. This affordable housing overlay, you see that line item up there under Savvy Ranch sites? The affordable housing overlay, basically, the property would have its base zone, whatever its zone is currently. It could be, currently allows for 3 units to the acre. And they could develop under that base zone standard. They can also develop under this affordable housing overlay. And this affordable housing overlay only applies to certain sites. The affordable housing overlay requires a minimum density of 20 units to the acre and a maximum of 35 units to the acre. If you build within the affordable housing overlay, you're obligated to build at least 20% affordable units, whether they're for sale or whether they're for rent. We don't dictate that situation. So what's different, one of the criticisms we heard in the last housing element cycle was you had all these sites that were zoned for affordable housing, you said this was an affordable housing thing, and a bunch of projects were developed and they didn't develop as affordable housing. That's again the challenge that we have here is that we can't require them to build affordable housing. We have to zone for it to allow for it, but we can't force them to build it. State law, it's a challenge here. What's different this cycle is with these overlays, we're allowing for them to build within that density. I'm getting feedback somewhere from this.
Go ahead.
Anyway, we're requiring that 20% minimum, they have to provide for a 20% affordable if they decide to develop within utilizing the standards of the overlay. They don't have to utilize the standards of the overlay. They can keep their base zone and develop under that standard if they want. We can only put the rules in place, and the state has a lot more rules that can control what they can and can't build. David, I don't know, have I missed anything critical with this question?
I would make the point too, if you look at Savvy Ranch, you'll see that there's a identification of 520 low and very low income housing units down there. That's where we have some of the most density. The state anticipates that land is expensive. If you put more units per acre, it'll reduce the price. You could also drive down to Irvine and go along Jamboree and see some very expensive housing at 60 units per acre or 50 units per acre. So as Nate keeps saying, we are obligated to create a roadmap for how it's possible to get there. The free market is going to decide what the outcome is ultimately in Yorba Linda. And if past is any indicator of future, unless there are special projects that are dedicated developments, like some of the examples on that one sheeter we gave you, where like Jamboree Housing Corp or some other really top-notch low-income housing development provider comes in and does a joint project with the city, you're going to end up with a lot of higher-end community development in the city of Yorba Linda. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I'll just teen off of that a little bit more clarification. So it used to be that prior to 2011, cities had redevelopment agencies, and the governor at that time eliminated redevelopment agencies. As part of redevelopment law at that time, cities would get tax increment from improvements that they would make in certain areas of the city that were redevelopment areas. And the tax increment would be used to fund construction of improvements in an area for economic development reasons. We also used a lot of that money to help build our parks. But the law allowed that tax increment to be used for city services under the condition that 20% of it would be set aside for housing. It was called the 20% Housing Set Aside Fund. So across the state of California, cities used to have a pot of money that they could use to help write down the cost of building housing. And they would work with affordable housing developers to put projects together. And the city's contribution would be one of many layers of financing that would go into making a project with some level of affordable units in it possible. It would close the gap between what it costs to build the project, how much revenue would be generated by the project given the covenants that were placed on the sales prices or rents that could be charged for some number of units in the project. And that way it would pencil or be feasible. So the projects in Savvy Ranch, Oak Crest Terrace, Oak Crest Heights, those were subsidized, if you will, by the city using those housing set-aside funds. In today's world, it's become increasingly more difficult to do projects with affordable units in them because cities don't have that pot of money to assist anymore. Most of the affordable housing that gets built has a portion of the units dedicated to affordable, and affordable developers use other financing mechanisms to make that happen in order to close that gap. The California Tax Credit Allocation Committee is another state agency in the Treasury Department which issues tax credits, 4% and 9% tax credits, to developers of affordable housing in order to help write down the cost these days, but those funds are very competitive. And so projects have slowed down with affordable units in them, and honestly, the market is so strong in Yorba Linda for market rate housing that a lot of the sites got scooped up by market rate builders last time, and they got built at the sweet spot, not at 20 units to the acre, but most of those sites that were zoned 20 to the acre actually developed at 15, because that kind of allowed them to build that product type, which was a townhome for sale condominium project, right in that $800,000 price range, which is where the market in Yorba Linda and much of Orange County kind of was sitting at that time. And so you get projects, like the project across the street from the Richard Nixon Library, for instance. That's 10 unit per acre project, and it sold for around 800 to $1 million. And it didn't include any affordable units, in fact. So they contributed, I think, some fees to the city's funds that we use for giving mortgage assistance and first-time homebuyers program, et cetera.
So I want to acknowledge that we're almost out of time. Are you guys able to extend like an extra 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, we'll go an extra 10 minutes. Go ahead, Manson.
Okay, my question was for the checking out these extra credits that we can get from the existing zoning sites with the ADUs. Why do we limit out at only 400?
And not more? Make it a fast answer, Nate, but it's a good question.
Okay. The short version of this is we tried getting as much credit from the state as we possibly can. They've told all cities you can get as much credit based on your historic trend of ADU development. Of course, that was before they changed the law that allowed everyone to have an ADU, and it was during COVID. So we fought with the state, really pushed on them, talked about all the positive characteristics that Yorba Linda has as far as why ADUs are much more likely to be developed here. They gave us credit for a total of 400 units. That number is higher than any other jurisdiction has been able to get that I know of. And I tell everybody, I get cities that call me regularly asking how in the world I got credit for as many units as we did in Yorba Linda. It's a low number, but we definitely consider it
You're lucky to have that number.
To get that number.
Now.
Kathleen Julian, and I'd like to first say I appreciate and thank the working group for everything they have done, because I don't think it's an easy job, and I share everybody's concerns because I think we love Yorba Linda, and I think they are doing the best they can to watch out for us. And I hear that they need our vote behind all their planning. And if we don't give them our vote of yes in 2024, does all this evaporate?
Good question. So it would go back to the point that we had earlier about the risks of not having that housing element, loss of grants, big fines, and ultimately builder's remedy being the biggest risk. And I think what we keep hearing time and time again from the public, and what's becoming more and more evident in the media, is builder's remedy is a major. The nickname for builder's remedy should actually, that was like a euphemism. Somebody came up with that. I think others would call it builder's advantage. But whatever it is, it would take effect. And we can sit in this room and plan all we want, but fundamentally, we're going to be bypassed by state law. And there's going to be a lot of development in the town that your council has very little control over, is what's going to happen.
Point of
and actually, just one other note too, because there's a question that came up in prior workshops. Builder's remedy is not subject to a Measure B vote either. It bypasses Measure B entirely. So there's no vote from the public on any development under builder's
I have
remedy.
just a quick question too, actually. But for clarification purposes, builder's remedy is one of several different builders' waivers that they can get. If we vote in a site with affordable housing overlay, that builder has the same kinds of waivers and lessening of standards, all kinds of parking, allowances. Isn't that correct?
So we just talked about this a little bit. You want to?
I would say that builder's remedy removes all local control, essentially. What we're proposing here is we would still retain control.
Is that once it's an affordable housing overlay and the builder comes in at that zoning with affordable housing overlay, the city has even said that the developer is in the driver's seat, right? And that the health and safety requirements that are going to be required in order to stop the developer are very hard to hit. So once that site gets hit with affordable housing, we're stuck with whatever builder's remedy and all the other setbacks, design elements, all the standards, building
So-
requirements.
What's the, you want to clarify an answer to that?
Yeah, so if a developer comes in locally, let's assume that the housing element sites are approved by the voters and it goes into place, and a developer comes into a project site and proposes affordable housing on that project site, they would have to comply with the city's local regulations. There are some, like we discussed, density bonus does grant them some ability to request certain waivers to certain things, but it's limited. Builder's remedy removes all local control.
So I think what I'm hearing is builder's remedy gives much more latitude to the developer than the bonus density might otherwise give.
The other question I have is, because I'm not sure that's what I've been reading, but anyway, the other question I have is, what happens if what does the city intend to do if HCD does not give you approval in time for the November ballot? I mean, the first time you submitted your housing element, it took 5.5 months for HCD to get their approval to you. And now we've got a whole new building site inventory. None of the environmental work, or has some of the environmental work been done? So I'm just a little concerned about getting this plan in front of the voters. If we don't get it approved by November, what does the city intend to do? Will the city submit the previous plan?
So phenomenal question. Nate the Great.
So we're starting to deal in a little bit of what ifs, but we've been in discussion with HCD about the concepts that the working group has been discussing. And HCD verbally they've been telling us that they're comfortable with the changes. We're not starting from scratch. We're making revisions to the previous plan that HCD already approved. And so any additional feedback that comes that results in tweaks to the working group's recommendation, HCD for the most part has seen most of that already. And so
Aware that most of the affordable housing is going to go to Savvy Ranch?
yes.
So, and they're okay with that so far?
So far, they're okay with that. We are optimistic that we'll be able to get through even 2 rounds of review from HCD. We think we'll get it through in just 1 round of their review, and then we'll be able to stay on track. As far as the environmental question, we'll be tearing off of the previous environmental impact report that was already prepared. So a lot of the base work has been done, especially since this is a revised plan to the previous. Many of the sites are still the same, with reductions on those sites and the introduction of. Primarily it's a big introduction of a new site in Savvy Ranch. So we're not too concerned about timing getting in the way of getting this in front of the voters.
Okay, another question.
Hi, my name's Dee Dee. I represent a big portion of the equestrian community in Yorba Linda, so I hope you'll allow me a couple, I have a little list from them. And that is, I'm probably not going to be favored in the room, it sounds like, but I'm okay with that. I'm used to it. Anyway, so 75% of the people voted no, right? So my question is, why did our city council hire a consultant to change our mind instead of go to bat for the 75% in ways such as, I know Huntington Beach is the lone soldier out there, but had our city council rallied city after city after city, maybe the state would listen. That's just one idea. I know the gal behind me is going to throw stones at me, but why not put like a Brea Mall in Savvy Ranch, and Kohl's stays, and the whole thing is housing. I realize that's a lot. I think you should do both exits, the one over the river and the one by the freeway, make it an easier in and out for everybody. And then also, why not outsmart them? Why not, instead of joining in, outsmart them? The ADUs, I hear the number 400, and I don't know if this is a possibility, but could you have everybody who has a half acre or any kind of land or whatever you need to have a second or a first or second ADU? What if you all apply? Can you get more? Because they're really, they've really applied, just like, you zone it, but they don't have to build it, kind of thing. So that's those questions. And then
Is there any chance we can answer some of these real quick before we get too further down the list?
Whichever way you want to do it. I just don't want to run out of time. I've been raising my hand all night.
I'm sorry, we've had a lot. So I guess I'll say one thing I'll let Todd speak to the legal questions about what other legal battles to get into. I'll just say one thing from my perspective, since I'm the consultant that was allegedly hired to change your minds. I wasn't hired to change your minds, right? I was hired to get together a group of residents and let them decide what they want to get done, and then give them the ability to get the information they need to make some decisions, then put it in front of you and stand here and make sure you have even more information. So, and to be very clear, the city can't advocate for how you should vote on the ballot measure. We haven't tonight told you whether or not you vote yes or no on whatever future ballot measure there may be. You may hate the future ballot measure, in which case you can vote no if you don't like it. My job here is not to convince you to vote for that ballot measure. My job is just to make sure you have as much possible information. And I think this is a very complex area of public policy that if you don't have all the facts in front of you, it can be confusing and challenging. And certainly we heard a lot from our working group members that there was some confusion from their perspective on some of the issues and the trade-offs that now that we've spent more time talking through the issues, I think it's changed their perspective. Russ, did you have a comment on that, or was there? Okay, can you talk to the legal, I guess, we've talked about the legal already, but.
Dee Dee, hey, were you here earlier when I went through all the legal? Yeah.
Okay, well then we don't have to regurgitate that.
Yeah, nothing's changed in the past 15 minutes. I mean, in short, the city took its shot legally through the procedures we thought we had a shot at. We lost. Everybody else lost. Huntington Beach has fought the fight. Some would say valiantly. They've lost every step of the way. And in my opinion, could be wrong, they will continue to lose and spend a lot of money. So the choice in front of the city council, which directs me what to do, based upon often my advice, was we're not going to, do the Don Quixote thing, tilt at windmills, and just spend money if in the end there's no real purpose and it won't get us anywhere. That's the answer, I think, to your question.
And I would also just observe, because I think you raised some questions about outsmarting them. David and Nate, they're not excited about what was pushed down on the city. That's not their vision. They're passionate, particularly, not that Nate isn't, but David's been in here 27 years of your career or something like that, a long time. So at the risk of speaking for him, this isn't his dream is not to wake up and put a bunch of high density housing in Yorba Linda, because he loves this community the way it is, and he's trying to figure out how to navigate it as best as possible.
The contrary to that,
yeah,
Mr. Ryder.
Yeah, so we're trying to innovate around things, and obviously we welcome more ideas to make that happen if there's a way to get around it. And then just on the ADU item, fundamentally, we're lucky to even have that 400 because they really looked at your past history, and past history we didn't have nearly that pacing, but because the nature of our lands here, it's certainly viewed as more viable to get ADUs in Yorba Linda than a lot of other communities because we have so many big lots. All right, that was some of the questions. Do you have a couple more we can try to address?
So number 2 was, it feels like Yorba Linda is always in a hurry. We were one of the first ones to turn in the first time, and I feel like, we have a whole year left. Maybe a little bit more take a wait and see approach to see if any lawsuits or if anything new happens. I've even heard some constitutional things are in there. So that's another thing. And then when you say, we just need to rezone it, they're not going to build it, I urge you all to look at Measure H and I, because almost all of it got built, almost no low-income housing, so they're just kicking the can down the road. We got 2415, next time we'll get 5,000. It just keeps going. It's not working out like it's supposed to.
So can I just speak to a couple of those questions too? So I stood up here earlier and I said, when we zone it, just anticipate that at some point or the rest of the duration it will be built. Nobody's telling you we're not going to build that stuff. We've seen market forces that oftentimes come in under the density that was zoned, but that's just been our historic experience. We can't guarantee that. So it's safe to assume that it will be built out within 3 to 5 years of the zoning taking place. We'll give you one more, and then I want to make sure we get to a couple others.
Let me address this one, though, Ryder, because there was the question of why the rush? Why are we in such a hurry? Had we not hurried and got our housing element approved by the state, we would be subject to conditionally. We would be subject to builder's remedy right now. It's because we hurried and got that conditional certification that we're not subject to builder's remedy. I think that's really important to understand. And then it's because of the time extension that the state granted to cities that had conditional certification that allowed for them to have some additional time. And there's also just a series of steps that you have to go through in order to get the plan put before the voters. 88 days prior to the election, you have to have the council certify the election. You have to hold a public hearing in front of the city council. You have to hold a public hearing in front of the planning commission. The timeline that Ryder had up here earlier, I mean, each one of those steps, in order to hit the November 2024 election, we have to hit each of those steps, otherwise we miss the November election, and if that happens, we likely lose our conditional certification of our housing element by default.
My sense is that if there was some sea change in a lawsuit, say Huntington Beach came up with a magical ruling that resulted in eliminating arena housing allocations, I can't speak for the city council, I assume they would change direction before July of 2024, before they were to move forward and put something on the ballot, would be my perception of how they would probably respond if there was a lot more local control emanating from some legal determination or something like that. Okay, one more question and then I want to try to get to somebody else.
Okay, and just to clarify, Measure H and I, we were all told by city council, rezone it, they won't build it, and it didn't happen, just to clarify. I don't know about Z, but that was H and I. The last one then is, I've been told this, but it's unconfirmed, that you have to be out of compliance for 2 cycles before anything will happen. Because of this new remedy, whoever, is that not the case, or was that never the case?
So Todd, can you, or Nate, can one of you answer the question about when we're out of compliance and lose our conditional?
Yeah, I wish that was the case, but unfortunately it's not. We likely, San Diego, they lost their certification. It took about 30 days for the state to send them a letter that said, you've got 30 days and then we're pulling your certification. So I would anticipate that if this measure fails in November, that the state will that we'll get a letter from the state by the end of the year, by the end of 2024, that says you've got 30 days to bring this into compliance, or we're pulling your conditional certification and you'll be subject to builder's remedy.
Okay, one more question. I saw a hand over here on the left. Did I miss it? No? Right here, Manson up front.
I'm Dee Wade, and this has been really informative, but I keep going back to, where did builder's remedy come from? And, you know, it seems like you have that choice or you have this choice. It doesn't seem like we have a choice. It just seems like the railroad to nowhere to me.
So,
you know, we're going to get it whether we like it or not.
Well, I'm not sure you're going to get it whether you like it or not.
We're going to get something.
Well, correct. Something. So to be fair, and I'll let Todd clarify where builder's remedy actually came from, because that's a great question. And we're not trying to lead with that to scare you, but it was very clear talk. Yeah.
We just don't have a choice.
That's it. So, and that's fair. What we kept hearing from the public is, please explain this builder's remedy thing, because it's very confusing. And fundamentally, I would just say, if we at least adopt a housing element, it's better than builder's remedy, is the perception of some people we hear in terms of their choice. Todd, can you explain where builder's remedy comes from?
Builder's remedy is a section in part of state law called the Housing Accountability Act. So it was a law passed up in Sacramento, and it imposed this remedy for cities that don't have the certified housing element, along with other options for builders to build. It was challenged in the court system. City said, hey, zoning, that's city business. State, stay out of it. California court said, nope, state law supersedes local law. You're stuck with it, city. That's where it came from. So.
It sounds like dictatorship.
I am outside of politics. I always joke with people when they ask me about politics, don't talk to me, because I love everybody and I hate everybody. So that is a political question I'm not going to get into.
All right, so we're going to wrap up here. First of all, I think we have a comment about the wildfire event.
Yeah, so I just want to do a quick plug. I'm in the working group. I live in a very high severity fire zone. I back Chino Hill State Park. So this was a big topic last year. And the state said they don't care, right? But the city heard and said, okay, we heard you, we know this is an issue, so they put together the safety group, and I went to the last workshop. I'm just saying, please, everybody go, because the head of OCFA is there, the head of OC Sheriff's there, Southern California Edison's there, gas companies there, the water utilities. They go there and talk about these things because that's what that group is for. and it's about our evacuation plan. It's about discussing these issues. This can't necessarily address that, but the city is addressing that. So it really is a good workshop, so please go.
Okay. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question tonight, but I appreciate your patience when we get through a lot of questions, and for hearing the presentation, for taking the time to engage as residents. Please, if you have feedback on the housing element, or you want to learn more, or you have questions, this magical YL housing element at yorbalindaca.gov is a great email address. It comes to me, Nate, David, all the housing experts you talked to this evening. Stay involved in this issue. We'll be at Planning Commission at the end of the month for additional consideration on the housing element. And please go back, grab flyers on your way out, and take it to your neighbors, and please encourage them to learn more about this issue and ask questions. Thank you all very much for your time tonight.